Hello, everybody. Welcome to this CREATE seminar on partnership research. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining today from Gadigal land. It's the land in which I live and work and raise my children. I want to pay my respects to elders of the Eora Nation, past, present, and emerging. My name is Kelly Freebody. I'm an associate professor in the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. My research interests are in applied theatre, drama education, social justice, and in school community relationships. I teach in the School of Education and Social Work. I teach the pedagogy and social justice units and the pedagogy units in the secondary education program. A lot of today's talk is really based in the education space because it's where I work most. There is, I think, a lot of crossover between the work of teachers and the work of arts practitioners here, because I think that often when we talk about research in the arts and when we talk about research in arts education, we're talking about research that happens with participants, research that happens often in negotiation with institutions. Now, I talk a lot about schools because that's where I work, but I also know of an enormous amount of work that happens in hospitals, in community centres, in prisons, and in schools. And so hopefully, no matter what area you work in the arts and in education, you'll be able to take something away from this. A lot of the work is based on work that Professor Michael Anderson and I have done together, thinking around what it is to have good partnerships with research participants, what it is to have meaningful partnerships with the institutions and the fields and the professions in which we work. And a lot of the work that you see here was actually based on a book that we wrote together called Partnership Research in Education. So acknowledging Professor Michael Anderson there. Let's begin. Firstly, what is partnership research? Seems like an appropriate place to begin. So partnership research at its core is these four things. I will go into obviously more specific detail through the course of this presentation about what it involves and some of the methodologies that we might use. But let's start right at the beginning with some big principles. Firstly, it is about having relationships with research participants or with sites, research sites, research partners that are reciprocal and mutually beneficial. Okay, it is not just you coming in to serve your needs as a researcher on these participants whom you are researching. It is actually about a negotiated relationship around the research. There is engagement on both sides, okay? So when we talk about a negotiated relationship around the research, it is that the partner is engaging with the research as well. They are not just being researched on. And in that way, it actually moves beyond a hierarchy of researched and researcher. And this point here about the democraticness, of the relationship, having a more democratic relationship, is not just a practical thing. It's not just that they are it's a practically more democratic relationship where people get to make decisions about how things happen in the research, but it's also an intellectually democratic relationship. It's an acknowledgement that the knowledge and the skills and the understanding that the participants bring, that the people working in the institution or the research site bring, and that the researcher bring, may all be different, but are all vitally important to the process. What is partnership research not? So first thing I want to say, partnership research is not a method in and of itself. So if you're somebody who's considering doing a PhD or a master's or something in the area of partnership research, it is not something you can say, this is the methodology I'm using. It's a framework for research. It's an approach to research, but there are methodologies within that. Okay, so you're doing partnership research, you still have to make a decision about what methodology that partnership research will undertake. And there are some methodologies that lend themselves really well and easily to partnership research. In fact, there are some methodologies which I'll talk about later in this presentation that can only really be done through partnership research. And there are other methodologies that do not lend themselves very well to partnership research at all. Most methodologies are somewhere in the middle, can be done through usual kind of more hierarchical researcher-researched relationships, or can be done through partnership research. It is also not working on or at or for an institution. It is not just having a good relationship with the institution that is your research site, okay? So let's spend a little bit more time with that idea. So it's really great and important, no matter what kind of research you're doing, to have good and respectful relationships with your participants and with the research sites that you're working, okay? That's great. It is not partnership research. Partnership research is actually beyond that, okay? More than that. That is not to say that the sort of research that you might do that has really, really good relationships isn't important research, okay? So firstly, a lot of people will say to you, well, I'm doing partnership research because I have a really great relationship with the teachers that I'm doing research on. That's not partnership research. That's having a great relationship with your research participants, and it's fantastic. The second point there is, although I think partnership research is fantastic, there are also times when it's not appropriate. And in fact, there are also times when I want to do research that is more kind of regular and hierarchical, you know, or there are times when I want to do research where I sit with a policy and do a policy analysis, and that research is really important too. This presentation is to say partnership research is great, but it's not a presentation to say that partnership research is what we should always be doing, okay? Lots of different kinds of research, having a diverse research perspectives, having diverse research knowledges, having diverse research practices is a really important thing in our field. It gives us different, more nuanced, more crystallized understandings of what it is we do in schools or in arts institutions. And so that last point is that lots of methodologies don't fit neatly into partnership research, and that's okay, okay? So it's okay to do methodologies that aren't partnership research. It's not okay to do methodologies that require partnership research and not have thought about what that partnership research is or how it's being undertaken. It's also not great to say that you're doing partnership research without giving any real thought to what that looks like, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it. So the point is not here that you have to do partnership research or that you should be doing partnership research. The point of my talk is to say that if you want to do partnership research, fantastic. Do it really deliberately and thoughtfully. Consider how you're going to do it. Consider why you're doing it, and consider whether or not it really suits the sorts of research questions that you want to ask. Okay, so now into my substantive sort of section of the talk. Why do I think partnership research is important? You know, one of the things that Michael Anderson and I, when we sat down to begin these conversations that ended up in the book, we were thinking about what is it that working really powerfully and productively with your partners, what is it? Because it is hard in a lot of ways. It's harder to do because you have to relinquish a certain amount of control over the research. But what does it bring? What does it give us as researchers, and what does it give us as a field? And what we came away with was that it actually allowed us to do research that made knowledge that mattered, right? And it matters at the time. So when we think about a normal research project, I go and I do my policy analysis, and I sit there and I'm doing the work. I'm thinking about this policy. I'm using a policy analysis methodological frame. I'm coming up with some conclusions. I'm writing a discussion paper, or I'm writing a journal article, and then that gets disseminated. And then maybe somewhere down the line, once it's read, somebody enacts it in a policy-making space, and it matters. But that's a long sort of process. And it's not the mattering, the on-the-ground making a difference of that research is not necessarily happening while I'm doing the research. One of the great things about partnership research is that it is. If you are going into a primary school and you are talking to teachers about what they need in terms of literacy support, and you're talking to teachers about how to implement a media or filmmaking course that might support students' literacy, and you are actively doing that as part of your research, and the teachers are going in and doing this intervention study, it is making a difference as it's happening. It's making a difference to the students that are participating. It's making a difference to the teacher in their practice. It's making a difference to the school and the sorts of programs that it might implement. Okay, it's making a difference. It's mattering as it's happening. You are making knowledge that matters. And so I think that's a really profound consideration when we're thinking about working in spaces, particularly with the sorts of work that we often work with in schools, but also as artists and as creative workers, is that we're often working with embodied processes. And so having that experiential learning and bringing that experience into our research and allowing the experience to take center stage is a really kind of central part of partnership research. It also has the ability, one of the other reasons why I think partnership research is really important is because it has the ability to give us a sort of a multi-dimensional understanding of a problem. Particularly when we think about some of the things that we research in education, some of the areas that we work as arts educators or as arts practitioners, which are often in communities, often in institutions, often with people who are experiencing marginalization and people who are having a multiplicity of experiences around this one thing, be that learning, be that art making, be that experiences of homelessness or whatever it is. That multiplicity of experiences, it's a complex and intersectional space that we work in when we're working with people and institutions around an issue like learning, and then we're coming in as researchers. And so the partnership research allows that vibrant, dynamic, and often messy space to be part of the research in a productive way. And what that allows coming out of the research is a multi-dimensional understanding for researchers. We understand how things are experienced at different layers within institutions, on an individual level, through theory, and all of those things combined. And so taking up that idea and looking specifically at the example of education and schools here, how is it that new knowledge and ideas might matter in education? Okay, so we can talk about making that dynamic space that we do research where knowledge is mattering as we do it, as well as how we disseminate it and analyze it. Let's think about the layers that we are hitting there in terms of doing the research and making the research and knowledge matter. Think about the levels of the system here. So we've got the teachers and the students in the classroom that we're working with and doing some sort of research with. We've got the leadership of the schools. We've got, principals, deputies, welfare officers, depending on what the study is. We've got the parents in the communities potentially that are being served by the school. We've got regional systems, departments of education, local governments, local literacy coordinators, hub schools that might be impacted by the research that we're doing. Got curriculum development at a state or national level. We've got policy development at a local, state or national level. And then we've got the academic community, okay, who get the work through our dissemination at conferences and through journal articles, all of that sort of stuff, which then feeds back into the foundational knowledge of the field, but also feeds into how we train the next generation of teachers. It feeds into our teacher education programs at universities, because that's where that... So you see these multiple layers in which the knowledge that you're creating through your research, through productive partnerships, can really matter, both at the time and afterwards. So what are the theoretical underpinnings of, how can we understand where this is coming from a theoretical space? Things that are foundational to the work, the big, broad ideas. And the first one is praxis, okay? And for those that don't know the term, there are lots of different ways of defining the term praxis. A lot of people would define it as theory that informs practice, and that then practice then reinforms the theory. So it's like a circular, sorry, learning how to talk still, circular relationship, a cyclical relationship, I guess, where the theory and the practice are constantly informing of each other. Stephen Kemmis has a really nice way of understanding praxis, where he says, yes, it's the theory informing the practice, but it's actually much more than that. You also bring your values. You brought how and when and from whom you learnt that practice into the practice. You brought all the research that we understand about that practice into the practice. And then you feed the practice back into the research, into the reason that you're in the room, into how you're learning it and what you know about it and your values and your thinking around it, okay? So you're once doing both of those things. It's not forget everything you learned about it and go in and teach it. go into the classroom forgetting everything that you've learned. You actually take all of your learning, all of who you are, and all of the things that you brought you into the room with you. And then the experience of practice feeds back into that and brings you into the room next time. I love it as a teacher, and I love it as a theatre maker, because it's a great way of understanding the embodied, and it's a great way of honouring and highlighting the embodied and practical nature of our work, and the fact that it is not productive for us to separate the body and the practice from the theory and the research. But likewise, it's not practical for us to separate what we know about it and why we love it and the theory of it from how we practice it. So for me, that sort of philosophy really speaks to how I work. And it certainly, I believe, underpins partnership research. And the second big theoretical idea is the idea of collaboration, right? And when I said earlier on that partnership research is not having a great, respectful, and productive relationship with your research participants, that's cooperation, not collaboration. Collaboration is when they are active in the building of the work with you. You are building it together. Okay, so it is about collective, collaborative learning, collective and collaborative decision-making in this space. So I want to actually we'll talk about the practicalities of it in a minute. We've talked about the big theoretical underpinnings, but I actually think there's a further sort of step beyond the theoretical underpinnings here, which is what are some of the ideas, practical and theoretical and personal, that it's informed by. So it's interesting when we were thinking about the people we know that practice this kind of research, and the research that we've read and the people that we've worked with in these spaces, the first thing that came to mind for us was passion. And it's an interesting thing to have written in a research methods book, because it's not a word that you hear very often in the research methods space. We don't talk in the academy much in research about passion. It's seen as too emotional, too personal. But actually, I think that there's a really practical element to passion as well. And I think it speaks to that idea in praxis of what brings you into the room and what keeps you there. And I think that for a lot of teachers and for a lot of arts makers, passion is actually a very large part of what keeps them there. Doing partnership research is hard. You have to compromise and relinquish some control. You have to negotiate with institutions. Sometimes institutions that may not be as supportive to your way of thinking as you would like. Passion is very connected with that other kind of element that's halfway down the page, persistence. For us, passion is what keeps people persisting with this kind of work, and makes people interested in building those connections and sharing the work because they're passionate about it. So passion was one of the things that we really talked about. Grounded curiosity, which is kind of curiosity about what you're looking at, but more specifically, curiosity about how your research interest plays out here on the ground, right? When we talk about grounded theory, we're talking about allowing our knowledge to come from what's happening on the ground, right? Noticing the context and allowing that to build up and be part of the theory. And so bringing your curiosity into a space and saying, I'm curious about how people learn literacy through process drama, but more specifically, I'm curious about how they do it here, in this context, in this space, in this way. Guided subjectivity. We talk a lot about qualitative research, about all research really being necessarily subjective in some ways. And it's a really big part if you're doing a research project, and certainly it's something that you must do if you're doing a PhD or a master's, but I think all good researchers do it. You have to have a moment where you really position yourself as a researcher in the research and acknowledge your subjectivities. It's something that's always been really important for me because I am a teacher. And so when I work in education spaces, I bring with me knowledge about what it is that teachers are doing based on what I have done as a teacher. So I have an understanding of what it is to stand in front of a Year 9 drama classroom on a Friday afternoon. And so when I see a teacher do it, I necessarily interpret their experience through my own. Now, I think that that's a strength in research. I think that bringing a knowledge of how these institutions work, of how this work, why this work might be important, is a strength of the sort of how this work has been built through time and how this work has changed through time. I think all of those things are a strength, but I think you need to be very aware of them as well, and you need to position yourself very clearly in them so that your readers of your research can understand how your findings have become your findings. It allows a level of trustworthiness when you can be very open about that. And when we say guided subjectivity there, it's about letting what your knowledge of the institutions, your knowledge of the practice, guide your way through a little bit. Trusting it, okay? Being aware of it and acknowledging it, but also trusting it. Imagination and creativity, okay? Being able to imagine what you want, think about how different ways might work. When your partners are suggesting things that you may not have thought of, being able to have creative and imaginative responses to how things could work. And also, obviously, creative problem solving comes in there too. Persistence, we've discussed, it's hard, okay? And it's always hard to negotiate with other people. It's always harder, even still, to negotiate with institutions. And when you're negotiating with all of those three things, it can be extremely hard. And so having persistence and being able to keep showing up and keep trying will be very important in partnership research. Believing in a knowledge exchange. It feels like that shouldn't be hard. It feels like that should be common sense. But actually, there are a lot of ingrained ways of working that are hierarchical around someone like me going into a school as a researcher. And the relationships, there are expectations around those relationships. And it can be hard on both sides to move past that, to have a genuine knowledge exchange, to genuinely believe that the knowledge that we all bring to the process, including if it's with young people and students, their knowledge that they bring to the process can be kind of, sorry, I'm not expressing myself well, genuinely believing in the importance of the knowledge exchange and the co-construction of the knowledge, and believing that we're building knowledge together and letting go of some of the control and power. Connection with multiple audiences, we talked about that before, having a sense of how and why the research is going to inform policy, is going to inform institutions, is going to inform classroom practice, is going to inform student learning, is going to inform work in the academy. Being able to juggle all of those different needs is a core part. A commitment to change that is really, really kind of follows on from that. I believe that partnership research is not research for its own sake. I believe very little research is research for its own sake, but often, I become really interested myself in a particular thing, and I might go and do, the policy analysis or some membership categorization analysis. Right now, I'm really, really interested in how young people talk, how you can understand how young people conceptualize ideas of youth through their talk. And I'm using a very, very detailed conversation analysis and membership categorization analysis on some transcripts of young people talking about what it means to be young. Now, that is great research. It really informs me. It informs my understanding of how kind of young youth is sociologically and practically constructed in society. But it doesn't have a serious commitment to policy and practice. And it doesn't have a serious commitment to change. I'm not seeking to change the way that young people think about youth. I'm not seeking to change anything except my own understanding. Now, is that worthwhile? I believe that it is, particularly considering I teach at universities and I teach to people who are going to be teachers and we talk a lot about how we think about young people. But all of that said, I think partnership research needs to have a deeper and more explicit connection to change, because I think when you're working in partnership with people, you need to be really explicit about what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I think that there are lots of ways that partnership research, and I'll talk about these a little bit later, allow participant partners, I guess, to have kind of agency in the change space. So I think it's something that really should be considered when we're thinking about what we're doing and why. And then the last thing is a circular vision. It should be about finding out answers, but also asking new questions. There should be a sort of a cycle to the way that partnership research happens. It's about building relationships, maintaining relationships, and continually asking new questions about what it is that we do in practice. Okay, so thinking then about the theory and sort of some of the more, I guess, the ideals that inform partnership research, I want to talk a little bit about methods and methodology. So although partnership research is not a methodology in and of itself, I do believe it has a few clear methodological perspectives. And the main one is that it's a grassroots approach. And what I mean by that is it is about research ideas and research practices being built from the ground up, from the site's needs, the specific needs of the site in which you're working. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, and I've said teacher researcher models, but you could say practitioner researcher models or artist researcher models, they're just as easily, or student researcher models as well. And so the idea is that actually it is about making the people that are involved in the research as participants, as sites, as organizers, as critical friends, researchers as well. Okay. And why do we do that? Well, from a teacher researcher perspective, but also this is modifiable across others, I believe, it builds a more cohesive relationship between research, policy, and practice. Okay, think about that praxis stuff. It actually helps build that relationship. It protects teachers' professional autonomy, all right? It acknowledges the importance of teachers' knowledge in these spaces, and it allows them to have an active role in how knowledge is produced in education. It's not that they're just the practitioners. Here, we're the scholars in the academy and we're producing all the new knowledge, and then we're going to give it to the teachers and they'll practice it. It's not that model. It's saying you're out there doing it. You are at the coalface. Let's make new knowledge about what you do and why it's important. And let's do it in a way that doesn't just limit itself to your classroom, because what I can bring as a researcher and a scholar to this is that I can bring a dissemination into policy and into scholarship that will then feed the next generation of teacher education. Okay, so it allows teachers' professional autonomy and knowledge to be powerful in that space. And it acts as a form of resistance and almost advocacy too. It allows teachers to be active in forming public opinion. It gives them a voice straight to policy. And, you know, an example of that is that I was involved in a great piece of partnership research that was funded by the Department of Education. And it was working with 12 separate schools using design-based research methods, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and working in partnership with 12 separate schools. They were all schools that were receiving what was called priority funding, which means that they were serving communities that were experiencing some sort of intersectional disadvantage. And we worked with the problem that was originally brought to us that we received funding for were that in these priority schools, teacher attrition was not as good as it was in other schools. Teachers were leaving, and so in some schools leaving within the first year of arriving, but often after about a year, possibly two, and they were having a lot of trouble keeping staff and they didn't know why. And so we did initially a first conversation with this research where we went to the 12 sites and we talked. We talked to principals, we talked to teachers, we talked to students, we talked to parents, and we also talked to people in the community that worked alongside it, whether that was, you know, people that worked in welfare services, whether it was people that the local police. We talked to local librarians that had things to do with the school. We talked to local businesses that were involved in the school. So we talked to a lot of different people about the school. And we also did a big literature search. And what we did then was that we decided that what would be a useful thing to trial would be to develop a framework for teachers when they arrived in the school to use to research the community, find out more about the community, and start to build better relationships with the community, the school community, but also the parent and general community. Because one of the big ideas that was coming out, particularly from the teachers, was that they didn't feel they found, a lot of them were not from these communities, had gotten a job there. That was the first time they'd gone there, and they didn't feel that they connected well, and they didn't feel that they could be powerful, and they didn't feel that they had a lot of good influence in the community. They didn't feel like they belonged. And so we took the framework that we wrote to the 12 schools and said, what do you want to do? And the 12 schools all did really different projects with this one framework. And what that then gave the schools an opportunity, and the teachers that were working in the space, and sometimes the parents and the students too, depending on the school, an opportunity to, all of that was fed directly back to the Department of Education and is now part of a training package that the Department of Education uses when they're mentoring teachers in new schools. Okay, so it was a direct through line. The voices and the work of these teachers, these schools, these parents were directly fed back and are now influencing the work that's happening in the Department of Education, as well as in the way that we teach at the University of Sydney in teacher education. It's a really influential project there. And, you know, some of the readings from it are actually set readings through our courses. And so it can act as a sort of an advocacy and a resistance between policymakers, schools, and the research community. So what I want to do now is spend a little bit of time looking at a couple of specific methodologies that are very clearly partnership research methodologies. Now, the first thing that I'll say is that these are not the only methodologies that you can do partnership research with. Most methodologies lend themselves a little bit, at least, to this kind of work, particularly if it's most methodologies that work with participants have the option to do this kind of work. But these ones are really specifically designed to do partnership research. And the first one is probably one that a lot of you will have heard of, and it's action research. Okay. Now, action research is a form of research where usually a teacher researches their own practice. Okay, so it really is that teacher-researcher nexus, and where a teacher might say, I think I've got this problem in my classroom, or I think that these students are having trouble with this. I wonder if I did something, an intervention of some sort, whether I could make change. And I know that teachers ask themselves those questions and do those sorts of things all the time, but as do arts practitioners and lots of different professions. But the thing about action research is it's systematic. It is active and deliberate. It is sitting down and going through phases and documenting it as well. So it can be a very individual thing. It can also be, I've seen action research done really well in a group way, where a researcher, a PhD student, for example, one of my PhD students, has wanted to look at how process drama can help second language acquisition. And so they have worked with 4 teachers or 5 teachers that have self-identified as being interested in this area because of their students, because they work in in schools or with classrooms where there's a diversity of language needs. And together they've worked as a core group to build an intervention. And then the researcher, the PhD student, acted as a critical friend, partnership researcher with everybody as these teachers went and did this intervention. And then they would come back together as a whole group and collect and analyze and explore data and make change. And they went through an action research cycle. And so this is actually supposed to be a cycle. So that 6th box is supposed to then have an arrow that connects back to the first box, but I couldn't get PowerPoint to do it. So let's just imagine it's there. But the action research cycle is essentially this. It is identifying an area that would benefit from investigation. It is planning some sort of a change or intervention. It is then acting on the plan and observing, okay? And when I say observing, we say observing the process, but then also collecting some sort of data to understand how it's gone, reflecting on the action and exploring the data that's been collected during the process. Now, that data could be observations, that data could be notes, that data could be exit slips from students, that data could be, work samples that you've collected, pre and post tests. It could be anything like that. It obviously depends on what the intervention is. Okay, and then once you've gotten to that thing where you've reflected on what you're doing and you've collected some middle point data, you then replan, because you ask yourself, what's going right, what's going wrong? Is this as good as it could be? Could I do it better? For the students it's not working for, how might I change that? What should I keep going for the students that it is working for? And so you replan to accommodate the findings. And then you keep going with your replan and you collect more data and reflect more, and so on and so on and so on, until you feel like it's complete and you can start a new cycle with something else. So that's the action research cycle. Very similar to action research is something called design-based research, or DBR. And this is the thing that I was talking about with the Department of Education School Communities research that we did with new teachers. Design-based research is usually intervention-oriented, okay? But it is 100% designed to take place in real-world settings. So if you think about often when we talk about doing experiments or interventions, we have control groups, we have groups that are doing the intervention so that we can judge, you know, how much of it's the intervention, how much of it is other contexts, contextual sort of ideas, or we often psychologists will bring students into, you know, the white room where they take them away from all of these sort of variables to do tests and interventions on them. This is not that. This is planning an intervention, but planning an intervention from the grassroots, from the site, walking into a site and saying, what might an intervention in literacy look like here? What might an intervention in ESL and drama look like here? Doesn't necessarily matter if it might look slightly different in another place. It's about understanding the needs of this particular site and embracing that rather than treating it like a problem. So it's designed to take place in the real world. It's designed to take place in classrooms. It's designed to take place in schools. It's designed to take place in community settings. It's grounded in theory and research. So, you know, unlike other forms of practitioner research, that is not to say that action research isn't grounded in theory and research. Often people will bring some sort of a framework or a theoretical perspective or an instructional theory to an action research project, but it's not necessary, as in it's not a core part of the methodological process that they have to. They actually can use their own experiences as a teacher to wonder what might work, test it, see if it's working, all right? Whereas in design-based research, there is a step where usually people come with a framework to a site, or with a theoretical perspective or an interpretive framework to a site to work on that. So let's work with this theory, with this framework in this site. It's flexible and it's iterative and it's interactive, okay? So it is very similar to the action research cycle, right? It is about iterations. It's about collecting data, reflecting. It's about interacting with what's happening and with the participants themselves to build the data collection process and the data analysis process. It's integrated within a school and a community. It's not something that's being dropped on them. It's actually something that is built to be part of it. It's not supposed to be extra things that we do. It's supposed to build in with what we already do as an intervention. And part of that is a question about what makes this sort of research-based practice sustainable. It's not sustainable if they're doing it on top of everything else to be nice or because they feel like they should for the duration of the research. And then the minute the researcher leaves, it stops because it's not actually integrated into the work of the site. Design-based research is actually supposed to be integrated into the work of the site. And it's contextual. So the elements of the elements of the research, going back to that whole idea that there's an instructional theory or there's a framework that you're coming in with, needs to be properly aligned, needs to work within the site in ways that are productive. Okay, so there are phases of design-based research, and you'll notice that they're very similar to the phases of action research. You start with informed planning and implementation of a project. Then you continually take stock of where you're at and redesign it as you need to using data. Then you evaluate the local impact. How has the project gone? Okay. And then this last step is a little bit different. You then take that and go, okay, if this is the findings of the project in this site, in this context, how might this project be broadened to impact more sites, different sites? How could we broaden it to impact New South Wales education more generally, or other sites, or national agendas in this? How can it be generalized? Can it be generalized to inform different sites as well, or to inform policy making around this issue? So to give you just to run down the Department of Education school community one, we had 12 schools. We went with our inquiry framework, and with each one we did this process. So we went in with the framework that we had built that was based on the previous research that we'd done across all the schools. We then sat down and said to schools, how is it that you would work with this? And some schools said, well, we'll choose 2 new teachers and we'll get them to work really heavily with you, and you know, we'll interview them, and they'll go and they'll undertake this process and they'll report back. Others said, let's make it a whole school thing. Let's have a day where we work with this. We think about how we might do it as a school. We bring in some parents to work alongside us. Others, one of the schools said to us, we have to make this about literacy, because even though literacy is not the purpose of your study, we're not doing any research that's not about literacy, because that's our focus this year. And so we had a lot of negotiation, and every single school did it differently. One school brought in police and the local librarians and some of the local speech pathologists and other members of the community to all work with new teachers in the school, and actually developed a sort of a term-long, I guess, integration process using our framework, where new members of the school community actually spent the first term meeting with lots of different members of the community that worked alongside the school, and parents as well, in an attempt to use the framework. So there were lots of different approaches. And for each 12, we went through this process. And then at the end, we could have a big discussion about what worked, what didn't work, where things worked, where similar things didn't work, and all of those sorts of things. And we evaluated the potential for that framework to be used more broadly. There are lots of challenges to this kind of research, as you would expect. And so that's not to say that's a problem, but that's to say that if you're considering doing this kind of research, you need to have thought about these things, and you need to have thought about being very explicit up front with your partners about how you might manage them. Trust and respect are key, okay? You know, you're asking people to give up their time, you're giving up your time, you're asking people to do something brave, which is to become involved in a research process. And so there needs to be trust and respect that together you can do this work. There needs to be very clear communication strategies. Everybody is busy. Schools, schools, prisons, hospitals, community centres, universities, they're all very, very busy places that have really different communication strategies. Are you going to communicate through a school secretary? Are you going to communicate directly with somebody on their mobile phone? Do you have to pass some sort of clearance in order to be able to be given email addresses of the people that you're working with? All of those sorts of things. Establishing those protocols really early is really important. Apathy and disorganization is one of the things that you can find that when you go into a school or any institution, really, the principal could say to you, well, I want 6 people to work on this, and they'll choose 6 people, and 2 of them really won't want to be there, and they'll bring a sense of apathy and ambivalence to the study. And that can be really difficult to manage, and you need to have thought about what you might do in that space, and how you might get on the front foot by saying to the principal, these things, I need to have, if somebody wants to be involved, it needs to be on these terms. Competing agendas is really, really hard. Apologies, just a minute. Apologies for that, Anna. My kids showed up from after school. If you could cut that little bit out, that would be great. Okay, so competing agendas. Competing agendas can be really difficult. I mentioned when we were looking at in the school community relationship, we came in on one school was it has to be about literacy, which was really quite a difficult negotiation because it's not what the research was about. But I think as long as there's complementary agendas, you can actually design research where it's multifaceted, and the schools or the institutions or the participants or partners can get different outcomes from your outcomes, and that's okay. I think the problems come when the agendas actually don't work together. And so having an open mind and being open to negotiating the process so that everybody can get what they need out of it is fantastic. But being aware that sometimes it just won't work, and trying to push competing agendas together can actually result in problems on both sides. And then finally, there needs to be a discussion very early about what happens if there are findings that are not good, where sorry, what am I trying to say? What happens if you find something or some of the findings show the partner in a bad light? And there could be times where the partners say, I don't want you to publish that. Or what happens where the research doesn't work or doesn't achieve the outcome that's wanted, or it achieves what's wanted by the researcher, but not what's wanted by the school. And so there needs to be an early conversation about on what grounds you might not publish research. It actually becomes harder in partnership research to negotiate this than it does in more regular hierarchical research, because often we would say, well, it's all the research is anonymous, we're using pseudonyms, we can't tell who anyone is. Whereas sometimes in partnership research, schools will want to remain, because they're named partners, schools will be identifiable. Or you've got to have questions about when do we identify you, when don't we identify you? And these are conversations that need to be had early. It can be a daunting thing to do, to bring this up. But actually, if you go back to that first one there of trust and respect, if you go in with a clear idea of what could go wrong and some potential solutions for your partner that you present to your partner, it will increase their trust in you, because you're not scared to have these difficult conversations, and because it will appear that you've thought this through. Yeah, that you're not just kind of going along for a ride, that you've actually structured, that you've done this kind of work before, that you understand how this kind of work could go, and that you've thought about contingencies, and that will help make people feel safe. So it is important to have those conversations very early on in the process. So thanks for your attention, everybody. I hope that this has been a useful session for you on partnership research. It is a really dynamic and rich way to do research. There are so many ways that allow you to, well, it allows you to learn new things about the research process. It allows you to learn and take new perspectives on things that you're interested in, but it also provides a sort of a very practical and direct sort of impact. A very practical and direct, it allows your work to have a very practical and direct impact, not only in the site that you're working at, but also through into public policy making, into beyond the site, into similar sites or regional sites, or departments and institutions more broadly. It's a really active and dynamic way and productive way to do research. It's difficult and there are challenges associated with it, but it really is, I think, quite rewarding, and I would encourage you to think on it. Thanks very much.